What happens when one narrow strip of water suddenly holds the entire world by the throat? What happens when the tankers carrying the fuel that keeps economies alive, cities moving, factories running, and families warm are forced to stop, turn around, or vanish from the map of global trade? And if the Strait of Hormuz were ever closed completely, really closed, not just threatened, not just disrupted for a few hours, but sealed off in a way that no oil tanker could pass through, where would those ships go? Where could they go? That is the first question. But it is not the only one. Because behind that question comes another, and another, and another. What happens to gas prices in the United States? What happens to inflation? What happens to retirement accounts, to the stock market, to food prices, to shipping costs, to political pressure in Washington, to military pressure in the Middle East? Tu deo simple sense des deo weldu ije. Stable and things we're walk deo way day didu yellows today? Tije are not obstruct questions. Teia kitchen table questions. Teia paycheck questions. They are national security questions. And that is why a place many Americans could not point to on a map could suddenly become the most important place on Earth. The Strait of Hormuz is not large. That is part of what makes it so dangerous. It is one of those places where geography becomes destiny. On a map, it looks almost too small to matter so much. But maps can lie. A tiny choke point can control a giant flow. The Strait of Hormuz sits between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, and through that narrow passage moves an enormous share of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Iran. These are not minor players in the energy world. These are some of the countries whose exports help power Asia, Europe, and global markets. So when people talk about Hormuz, they are not really talking about a body of water. They are talking about a pressure valve on the modern world. And that is the part many people miss. The world does not just run on oil in the ground. It runs on oil that can move, oil that can leave the terminal, oil that can get onto a tanker, oil that can pass safely through a vulnerable corridor, oil that can reach a refinery, oil that can become gasoline, jet fuel, diesel, chemicals, fertilizer, plastics, heat, transport, life. We often speak about energy as if it were simply a matter of supply. How much oil exists? How meochi kn bipyompudu? How meochi iju stored? Bos supply iju onri hapu dos tori. Mubumontu iju do ado hapu. Maybe the more important happen in a crisis. Because a barrel of oil trapped behind a blockade may as well be a barrel on the moon. So imagine the moment the closure becomes real. Not a rumor, not a warning, not another round of tense headlines. Real. The first few hours would be chaos disguised as calculation. Traders would not wait for certainty. Markets never do. Oil prices would leap, not because every barrel had already disappeared, but because fear would race ahead of facts. That is how modern crises begin. First comes the price shock. Then comes the scramble for information. Then comes the realization that information itself is incomplete, conflicting, emotional, and expensive. Shipping companies would begin assessing routes, risks, liabilities. Insurers would start recalculating war risk premiums. Governments would convene emergency calls. Military commands would shift to higher alert. Financial networks would pulse with the same question. How long will this last? In those first 24 hours, the world would feel the tremor before it fully understood the earthquake. Tankers approaching the strait would hesitate, because hesitation in a danger zone is not weakness. It is survival. Captains do not move $1 billion. Cargoes into possible missile range because someone on television says the situation is fluid. Owners do not risk cruise because analysts think their closure might be temporary. In real shipping, in real war risk conditions, hesitation becomes policy. Many vessels would slow, hold position, or turn away to safer waters while awaiting instructions. Others, still inside the Gulf, might remain trapped, unable to exit. And those outside, headed in, might reverse course. That image alone tells the story. Steel giants, floating mountains of crude, turning around in open water because the narrow door ahead has slammed shut. But then the obvious question arrives. Turn where? If Hormuz is blocked, where do those tankers actually go? Do they simply find another lane on the ocean, the way a driver exits one highway and merges onto another? No. And that is exactly why this scenario is so serious. There is no easy detour. There is no giant blue arrow on the map that says alternate route. The world's energy system is not a neighborhood grid with plenty of side streets. It is more like a circulatory system with a handful of major arteries. Block one of them, and the whole body feels it. Some tankers would go nowhere fast. They would anchor or drift in safer waters, waiting for official guidance, waiting for naval escorts, waiting for charterers, waiting for insurers, waiting for signs that the closure was temporary and not the beginning of a broader conflict. Waiting is expensive. Bios is open, safer than moving blindly. Every day tanker waits, money burns, schedules break, contracts strain, refineries start calling, buyers start worrying. But waiting may still be the least bad option when the alternative is entering a zone that has become militarized, mined, or vulnerable to missile and drone attacks. Some oil exporters would try to redirect supply through pipelines that bypass the strait. Saudi Arabia has infrastructure that can move some crude across its territory to ports on the Red Sea. The United Arab Emirates has export capacity that can avoid the strait to a certain degree. These routes matter. In a crisis, they would become lifelines. But lifelines are not the same as replacements. That distinction matters. A backup route is not a substitute for the world's most important energy choke point. Pipelines have limits. Ports have limits. Storage terminals have limits. The volume that normally moves through Hormuz is massive, and no set of workarounds can simply absorb that flow overnight. That is the cruel reality of infrastructure. People hear alternative route and imagine continuity. But alternatives are often partial, not complete. They reduce damage. They do not erase it. And oil is especially unforgiving because it is not just a commodity. It is a logistics problem wrapped inside a geopolitical problem, wrapped inside an economic problem. A tanker cannot merely be assigned a new destination without consequences. Refineries are designed for certain grades of crude. Contracts are written around specific delivery windows. Shipping fleets are scheduled months in advance. Storage capacity is finite. The whole system is interconnected, but not infinitely flexible. And when flexibility runs out, costs explode. This is why the closure of Hormuz would not remain a regional problem for long. It would become global almost immediately. The first and most visible effect would be on energy prices. Americans do not need a lecture in maritime strategy to understand what this means. They know what happens when oil jumps. They see it at the pump. They feel it when filling up a truck, a car, an SUV, an RV. They feel it when a weekly routine suddenly costs more than it did the week before. And for many older Americans, especially those living on fixed incomes or carefully managed retirement budgets, those changes are not minor annoyances. They are real pressures. A jump in gasoline prices is not just a number on a screen. It is one more thing that makes ordinary life less predictable. But the pain would not stop at the gas station. It never does. Energy is the hidden ingredient in almost everything. When energy gets more expensive, transportation gets more expensive. When transportation gets more expensive, food gets more expensive. Building materials rise, airfare rises, delivery costs rise, manufacturing costs rise. Even products that seem to have nothing to do with oil begin to reflect the increase. This is how inflation spreads. Not always in one dramatic burst, but in 1,000 smaller adjustments that add up to something heavy, something draining, something people can feel before economists finish debating what to call it. And that is where the anxiety deepens. Because inflation is not just about prices going up. It is about confidence going down. It is about people feeling that the ground beneath their budgets is unstable. Older Americans remember periods when inflation ate away at savings, when headlines about energy crises did not stay on the foreign page, but moved into living rooms, businesses, and political campaigns. They remember that energy shocks have a way of reaching into everything. And they also know that when prices surge, governments do not get judged on explanations. They get judged on results. Financial markets would respond with their usual mix of panic, prediction, and overreaction. Stocks could swing sharply lower, especially in sectors sensitive to consumer demand or transportation costs. Energy companies might rise, at least initially, but a broad sense of risk would hang over the market. Investors would look for safety, and bonds, gold, the dollar, whatever, looked more stable than the storm. And that matters not only to big institutions, but to ordinary retirees, pension holders, and anyone whose future depends partly on market performance. A disruption in Hormuz would not stay in oil charts. It would ripple through 401ks, mutual funds, and retirement accounts across the United States. Then comes the larger economic question. Could a major shock like this push the economy toward slower growth? Yes, and that is what makes these crises so dangerous. Policymakers hate this kind of scenario because it creates the worst kind of dilemma. If prices rise sharply, central banks may worry about inflation. But if growth weakens at the same time, tightening too much could deepen economic pain. Businesses facing higher costs may pull back on expansion. Consumers seeing higher bills may cut discretionary spending. Confidence falls. Investment slows. Hiring becomes cautious. The economy does not collapse in one cinematic moment. It stiffens. It hesitates. It loses momentum. And even that economic story is only part of the picture. Because when energy security is threatened, politics enters the room like a storm. In Washington, pressure would build almost instantly. The United States has strategic reasons to care about freedom of navigation in the Gulf. But beyond strategy lies a more immediate force: public reaction. If Americans start seeing fuel prices spike and financial markets wobble, political leaders do not get the luxury of treating the issue as someone else's problem. Voters may not follow every shipping lane in the Middle East, but they understand when a global crisis begins costing them money. That translates into pressure. Pressure on the White House, pressure on Congress, pressure on defense officials, pressure on allies. Would the United States be forced to act? That depends on what act means. Action could begin with diplomacy, intelligence sharing, sanctions, emergency coordination with allies, oil realizing strategic petroleum reserves. It could expand into renewable côtes, regional military deployments, and deterrence operations. And if the closure involved direct attacks, mining, or repeated strikes on commercial shipping, the pressure for a stronger response could intensify. This is the uncomfortable truth. A blocked Strait of Hormuz is not just a shipping problem. It is a test of credibility, a test of how far major powers are willing to go to defend the global system they say they support. But America would not be the only one under pressure. Europe would be watching nervously. Asia would be watching even more nervously. Countries like Japan, South Korea, India, and China rely heavily on energy imports, and disruptions in Gulf supply would shake their planning, their industries, and their political calculations. For some, the immediate concern would be price. For others, physical supply. For all of them, the strategic concern would be the same. What if the world has become more fragile than we wanted to believe? What if one geopolitical rupture can expose how dependent advanced economies remain on a small number of vulnerable routes? And then there is Iran, whether directly involved or not. Any serious closure of Hormuz would inevitably raise questions about Tehran's intentions, its capabilities, and its threshold for escalation. Is the goal pressure? Retaliation? Deterrence? Bargaining leverage? Domestic signaling? Regional dominance? Every possibility would carry a different strategic meaning, but all of them would increase tension. And if Iran were blamed, fairly or unfairly, the risk of miscalculation would grow. Because crises do not unfold in neat sequences. They unfold in smoke, noise, rushed judgments, incomplete data, and political emotion. One move invites another. One strike invites a response. One accident becomes a symbol. One symbol becomes a reason for escalation. That is why the West itself could face division. Some governments would argue for firmness, for visible deterrence, for restoring maritime security by force if necessary. Others would argue that military escalation could make everything worse. Some would insist that the priority is reopening the strait at any cost. Others would warn that at any cost is the language nations regret later. These disagreements would not mean the danger is less real. They would mean the danger is so real that even allies would differ on how much risk they are willing to bear. And beneath all of that lies the deeper lesson, the one that outlasts the headlines. The Strait of Hormuz would expose a truth modern societies often prefer not to think about. We live in a world that feels technologically advanced, financially sophisticated, digitally connected, and broadly resilient. But that world still depends on old physical realities. Narrow waterways, pipelines, ports, refineries, power plants, tankers, choke points. The modern economy may trade in algorithms and data, but it still runs on molecules moved through vulnerable corridors. This is what energy security really means. It is not just about having resources. It is about having secure access to them at the right time, at a tolerable price, through routes that are not constantly one crisis away from disruption. It is about reliability, predictability, redundancy. And Hormuz, perhaps more than any other location, reminds us how much of the global system still depends on concentrated geographic risk. For years, many nations have talked about diversifying energy supply. Some have built strategic reserves. Some have expanded domestic production. Some have invested in pipelines, LNG terminals, renewable power, nuclear energy, or grid modernization. 올 오비우다에스 메테오스. But o 시비오 호무즈, crisis 우드 스틸 샌드, 에어 메시지 라이크 썬더 across the world. Not enough. Not enough redundancy. Not enough insulation. Not enough imagination about what happens when the obvious route disappears. People often invest in resilience after the crisis, not before it. They build the umbrella after the storm. They reinforce the wall after the flood. They learn the lesson only when tuition has become unbearable. And if the closure lasted not days, but weeks, or even months, the nature of the crisis would change. At first, the world would face a price shock. Later, it could face a supply shock. That distinction is critical. Early on, markets might be reacting mainly to fear, uncertainty, and anticipated shortages. But if flows remained constrained long enough, actual shortages could begin to emerge. Refineries might struggle to secure the crude they need. Airlines would face rising fuel costs and possible supply strains. Petrochemical industries would feel pressure. Shipping networks would tighten further. Governments would dip deeper into reserves. Emergency measures would buy time, but time is not the same as resolution. Strategic petroleum reserves could help cushion the blow. That is what they are for. They can calm markets, signal coordination, and ease near-term scarcity. But reserves are a bridge, not a destination. They are a temporary answer to a persistent disruption. They do not reopen a choke point. They do not rebuild confidence on their own. And they do not remove the risk of military escalation if the closure is tied to active conflict. Would naval escort missions be enough? Maybe for some traffic, under some conditions. But escorts are not magic. If the threat involves mines, missiles, drones, swarm attacks, or a broader regional conflict, commercial shipping remains exposed. A military presence can deter, reassure, and protect. But it can also become part of the escalation ladder. Every convoy then becomes a symbol. Every close call becomes a test. Every attack becomes a line crossed. That is why a prolonged crisis in Hormuz would be dangerous not only because of economics, but because it could slide, step by step, into something larger and harder to control. And if the world were forced to live under that pressure for months, the long-term consequences could be profound. Energy importers would accelerate efforts to diversify suppliers. Producers outside the Gulf, whether in North America, South America, Africa, or the North Sea, could gain fresh strategic importance. LNG in Perasuturiagcio would be reconsidered. Nuclear energy might look more attractive to some governments, not less. Renewable energy would be discussed not only as a climate solution, but as a security solution. Domestic production, stockpiling, supply chain localization, and infrastructure resilience would all rise on the policy agenda. In other words, a Hormuz closure would not merely disrupt the world. It could reorder the world. That matters for Americans over 50 in a special way, because many in that generation carry memory as well as concern. They have seen oil shocks before. They have lived through wars in the Middle East, inflation scares, recessions, gas lines in older eras, and the repeated promise that the world had learned its lesson. So when they hear about a crisis in the Gulf, they may not respond with surprise so much as recognition. Recognition that history has a way of returning in new clothes. Recognition that vulnerability never fully disappeared. Recognition that events far away can still reach right into daily life. And what do they want to know first? Usually not the fine print of maritime insurance, not the exact volume of bypass pipeline capacity, not the theoretical language of energy security papers. They want to know something much simpler. Will this raise the cost of my life? Will it hurt my savings? Will it make America more likely to get dragged into another conflict? Those questions are practical, but they are also wise, because they cut through abstraction. They ask what all this means where people actually live. The answer is that it could mean quite a lot. It could mean higher fuel bills, higher grocery bills, more market volatility, more political heat, more strategic tension. It could mean another reminder that global stability is not automatic. It must be defended, maintained, and sometimes rebuilt after it fractures. It could mean that a crisis thousands of miles away alters what Americans pay, how they vote, what they fear, and how they think about the future. So where would the tankers go if Hormuz were completely closed? Some would turn back, some would wait. Some would be rerouted through limited alternatives. Some cargoes would be delayed, restructured, or canceled. But that answer, important as it is, turns out to be smaller than the real one. Because the deeper truth is this: the tankers would not be the only things forced to change course. Markets would change course. Governments would change course. Military planning would change course. Energy strategy would change course. And ordinary families, trying to understand why another global shock has landed on their doorstep, might feel that their own financial lives had been pushed off course as well. That is the real power of a place like Hormuz. It shows how a narrow opening can cast a very long shadow. A few miles of water can hold the attention of presidents, generals, traders, and retirees at the same time. A single blocked corridor can reveal how tightly linked the world still is, how quickly confidence can evaporate, and how expensive fragility becomes when the illusion of normalcy breaks. We like to think the modern world is too advanced to be cornered by geography. But geography still waits for its moment. It waits in straits and canals, in pipelines and ports, in mountain passes and undersea cables. It waits in the places most people never think about until the day everything depends on them. And when that day comes, the lesson is always the same. Civilization may look vast. The global economy may look unstoppable. But sometimes it hangs, quietly and precariously, on one narrow hinge. If the Strait of Hormuz were ever closed completely, the first shock would be about ships and oil. The second shock would be about money. The third would be about power. And the deepest shock of all would be psychological. The realization that the world is not as buffered, not as distant, not as insulated as many had hoped. That one rupture can still send pressure through every layer of modern life. That energy is not merely a commodity. It is a foundation. A foundation for prosperity, for order, for mobility, for confidence, for peace. And maybe that is the final lesson. A blocked strait is not just a transportation problem. It is a warning. A warning about dependence. A warning about complacency. A warning that resilience cannot be improvised in the middle of a storm. Because when the narrow gate closes, the question is never only where the ships will go. The question is what kind of world we built if so much can be shaken by so little space.